Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call this final session for today into embodiment, I guess. It's been such a fantastic run of sessions for the last 3 days, and I've been really enjoying myself, and I'm sure you all have too, and been really looking forward to this particular talk. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Rick Prellinger as our keynote for the afternoon. And I say it's a great pleasure in part because in addition to Rick being someone who was very important for me as a young artist in terms of Rick's library and archive providing materials for me to work with and think with, when I decided whether or not to, or was debating whether or not to take a job at UC Santa Cruz, it was a really important feature that Rick Prellinger would be my colleague. And in fact, it was a real treat for me that he was 2 doors down. His office ended up being 2 doors down from mine. And I think in the 8 years that we have been there together, we've always discussed the idea of we really must make time to speak of the Hertzian. And so now the time has finally arrived. So very pleased for that. So Rick is an archivist, filmmaker, writer, and educator who has been involved with useful radio for many years as a hobbyist, author, and researcher. He's probably best known as the force behind the Prellinger Archive, which he started in 1983. And its collection of over 60,000 films was acquired by the Library of Congress in 2002. And since that time has grown even more to include 30,000 home movies and 7,000 other film items. Beginning in 2000, he partnered with the Internet Archive to make a subset of the Prellinger collection available for free online viewing, downloading, and reuse. So has definitely provided an incredible wealth of materials to artists and researchers and students and just interested people. His archival features include Panorama Ephemera from 2004, the project No More Road Trips, and his 30 Lost Landscapes participatory urban history projects, which have screened widely nationally and around the world, in this case, some of the other films. Together with Megan Prellinger, he co-founded the Prellinger Library, an experimental research library in downtown San Francisco, and a wonderful place to get lost in. Open since 2004. He is a board member of the Internet Archive and a speaker and speaks and writes on the future of archives very frequently. And as I say, I know Rick really as a colleague, so I also know him as someone who has just an incredible amount, an astonishing amount of expertise and overview at the same time. So someone who's really able to delve into the big picture in a tremendous amount of detail and complexity. And that's something that his students have incredibly valued and that we as his colleagues have as well. Rick also holds an extra class amateur radio license and operates as W6XBE and is rarely without a radio or a scanner in my experience. And I would say he is an avid or even an intrepid radio listener. So please join me in welcoming Rick to talk to us about useful radio today.
Thank you. We meet in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, the Piscataway Indian Nation, the Nacotchtank people, and other Chesapeake indigenous tribes. We acknowledge the history of genocide, forced removal, and systematic oppression that impact these communities and have enabled us to meet on their traditional lands. We understand that the livelihood of these communities and people is inseparable from the land, and that they continue to face loss, inequity, and discrimination through continuing colonialism. Thank you, thanks to everyone whose labor and vision have made this all possible, and thank you for the privilege of presenting my research and ideas at this amazing conference. We've been, let me just get a little more, I guess I can. We've been looking at ways that people have used and are using the wireless spectrum to make culture, art, and community, and also how we've been collecting and preserving the radio record. But until now, we haven't much focused on those areas of the spectrum that aren't well recorded or well preserved. These areas are where radio comes closest to life, where radio blends closely with human activity, where radio regulates human activity, where radio itself is human activity. And this is where useful radio fits in.
Radio test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Radio test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I was supposed to begin with that, but these new computers. Usefulness is a complicated concept, and I can't do full justice to it here, but to be clear, I borrow the idea of useful from Charles Ackland and Heidi Wasson's excellent book, Useful Cinema, excerpted above. And speaking simply, your takeaway maybe, useful radio is radio that exists to do a job, a function, as distinct from broadcast radio. I also want to recognize Kit Hughes's concept of applied radio, which is highly relevant here, and I highly recommend reading her all too short treatment of it in her outstanding book, Television at Work. Raymond Williams also briefly conceptualizes early radio, especially naval and maritime radio, as operational communication. But no matter what words you use, we're talking about the busiest and least examined areas of the spectrum. Useful radio is so ubiquitous that we don't typically notice it unless you're a dog. But it's the area in which radio demonstrates its greatest engagement with the world. It engages with art, as some of our fellow participants, such as Anna and Jeff, will be demonstrating tomorrow. As an instrument, it coordinates and regulates labor and the work of infrastructures, production, distribution, transportation, finance. It is deeply, all too deeply interwoven with policing, surveillance, and other functions of the state. It tracks and guides human relationships with the landscape, both work and recreation, and even animals and food are implicated with useful radio by means of trackers and RFID tags. Every one of us is an emitter, a receiver, a tracked subject of useful radio. It is ambient radio, as urgent as it is unheard. But it isn't necessarily radio that we might listen to, not simply because of the quotidian and often banal messages that it carries. It isn't all listenable. Much of it is made by machines for other machines, and much of it is created in unlistenable form, whether it's digitally encoded, encrypted, or receivable only with specialized equipment. This is the material for artists to modify and make listenable. Often its cryptic nature, as with the celebrated numbers stations, which many of you may know, renders it material for sampling and recontextualization. But unlike most broadcast radio, useful radio is sometimes best apprehended through metadata, or what signals intelligence, SIGINT people would call traffic analysis. It is not necessarily best listened to. I'll talk about it more later. And useful radio is often best perceived as evidence, as unprocessed and fairly raw. It isn't produced like much of the radio that we've discussed at this conference. This is not necessarily to its advantage. I might analogize. Most travelers focus on experiencing the train ride rather than the timetable. There's a tendency in much media scholarship to gravitate towards narratives or materials that can easily be narrativized and away from media that appears to be principally evidentiary. Many people who say they work on home movies actually concentrate on amateur films, which are more film-like and often have plots. Narrative features get far more attention than useful cinema, and more ears are tuned to broadcast than to useful radio. Useful radio is about listening for evidence and listening then to evidence. I'm going to play you a recording while the caption says what it is, and I hope you will listen carefully and try to understand. Useful radio, I will say that it remains one of the most residual and elusive media forms. It has hardly any archivists. Messages are only rarely preserved, and if so, often for limited times. And we know much more about the systems that produced and transmitted the messages than we know about the messages themselves. Here are the Blue Angels.
I believe it was Danny Tanner who once said, "Time to wake up, San Francisco."
May not be customary to play erotica at the Library of Congress. Useful radio broadcasts traces of labor that enable consumption and other economic activity. It moves the voices of the people who move the trains, and it disseminates carefully chosen words, often in the form of numbers and codes, often documenting policing, enforcement, exclusion, incarceration, repression, and relocation. Most people don't want to hear this, and it disappears in a fog of familiarity, to use Cheryl Higashida's quote of Eric Schatzberg describing Paul Edwards. I think I got that right. Useful radio lies outside the realm of most media study, and it hasn't been taken up by most media theory, so it's once marginal, and it can even be a bit weird. But what I hope to establish today is that useful radio might really be radio's mainstream, that broadcast is perhaps just the sweet and very popular frosting on radio's top, and that there's a vast area of useful radio that implicates histories, politics, and culture, waiting for scouts, for critics, for researchers. I need to say ahead of time that in useful radio, as in on the streets, policing takes up a lot of space, and therefore I can't avoid talking about radio as an instrument in policing and domination, especially when I cite histories of struggle and resistance, but there will be much more to talk about than policing. Here's a little soundbite.
Runner 1, do you copy? Over. Second, this is Runner 1, over. Runner 1, can I get a antibiotic-free turkey, 16 to 20 pounds on the smaller side, please, for Megan Prellinger, Prelinger. Over. Second, copy that. Over.
Eavesdropping on my partner at the supermarket. Useful radio also offers perspectives on race and gender in the 20th and 21st century. Others have remarked on the presence of racial and gender stereotypes in useful radio, from the overwhelmingly white and male world of radio hobbyists to the racialized landscapes of police dispatch centers. But looking deeper reveals histories with difference at their core, not simply still more articulations of whiteness. We can recognize BIPOC innovators and technical vanguards, such as these hams in the late 40s and early 50s, black social expression through citizens band radio, and useful radio as a community tool for resistance, struggle, and justice, and a form of tactical media. And we can also consider useful radio's own history as a tool of white supremacy and control over non-white bodies on the street and on the job. So this presentation, to wind this up, is an abbreviated prospectus of my own book research, but it could be yours as well. This is all about encouraging exploration, discovery, scrutiny, critique of these sectors of the spectrum where so much more is happening than broadcast. It is also a good place for interventionist scholarship. So please also consider this a recruitment talk. Some of my critical influences, just to get some very important business out of the way. I've had to limit what I can include in this talk, so I hope that you'll understand that everything you see and hear is really an alias to a much broader body of evidence and research. A little bit about my positionality to begin with. Half of my brain has been tuned into radio in one way or another since I was a child. I grew up in a heavily European-influenced family, living in a city that was 1/3 black and also heavily populated by people of an Italian-identified background. Because my father was Austrian, we had a shortwave radio that we often listened to. And because New Haven had experienced dramatic civil unrest and police violence in the late 60s and early 70s, I became interested in understanding the structural and operational attributes of policing. I began listening to useful radio in 1971. As a friend who's in the audience actually once said to me, I was interested in how the government works, and I continued to learn. This was my first federal frequency list, which I got from a local scanner dealer in late 1977. It really blew my mind. It was a revelation that the workings of these agencies could at that time be openly heard. Because with the introduction of digital scanners, it became possible to explore the local wireless landscape with great precision. While there were quotidian business and government activities and local police and fire, I focused on the poorly documented frequency ranges like this. And tuning and listening, I learned that radio could expose undisclosed and unmediated overlays of activity occurring in the same geography as mine. No news source, no broadcast tells as much as useful radio, but at the same time, no stream is more fragmentary or ambiguous. I had a publishing record before I became a professor. I edited frequency directories and worked with a network of hobbyists all over North America. My research into federal government radio systems caused concern in Washington, and an overly broad FOIA request I made caused the government master file, which is a massive and fascinating database of federal radio frequency assignments, to be classified in 1982. That was sort of my fault. Since about 2019, I've been focusing on useful radio as a lightly explored point of intersection between technology, culture, and politics. And more specifically, I became quite interested in how useful radio has been an integral part of histories of struggle and resistance, and what place it might occupy in the toolbox of strategies toward reparative historical research and accountability. And as I pulled away from teaching film and media, I started doing more work with radio. Anna mentioned that I have a radio amateur license. I take part in the experimentation that's deeply rooted in that community, and so on. Useful radio surrounds us. I have a long list, and I'm not going to say it all. The walkie-talkies you see, radios that just receive like pagers and the message signs along the highway, radios that mutely transmit data from one machine to another, GPS trackers, river-level sensors, toll transponders, your GPS chip, little walkie-talkies, drones, et cetera, et cetera. Workers in Amazon warehouses receive their algorithmically timed orders, regulating their movement in time and space via useful radio. It also has its leisure functions, CB operators, many people who have family radios, those that may come out with that horrible little chirp, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of my favorite hobby books. It means much more than it might seem. It's an introduction to perceiving the invisible, which is the first step towards mapping, analyzing, and fixing responsibility. You know, I'm reminded just momentarily about Brecht trying to understand the workings of the commodity market. Because it was invisible, it wasn't something that you could see, and I think the same is true here with wirelessness. Geographies are critical to thinking about useful radio. Radio creates its own geographies. We can think about communities that radio serves and creates. We might also think about fabulating geographies that are constituted by radio transmissions. As a system of transmitting and diffusing commands, instructions, and situational information, useful radio simultaneously maps and reproduces geographies of power and control, relaying messages from and to centers of authority to peripheries where information is received or orders are given or carried out. And by tracing origin, destination, mode, characteristics of transmissions, either by listening to them or analyzing traffic, you can trace paths of hierarchy and control. And going beyond just the evidence, it's also possible to interpret radio transmissions as more than indicators, as acts of power in their own right. And so this then permits us to think, to imagine wireless traces as potentially fruitful documentation of human histories of power and resistance. We might think of spectrum as landscape, and like cities and neighborhoods over time, certain areas of the spectrum come into and out of heavy use. This is the official US government frequency allocation chart. It's pretty badly designed. It rests on the foundation that the spectrum is a scarce resource that needs to be heavily regulated, and there's a lot of reasons to know that that might not be true. I think the Australians do a much nicer job. We're not going to study Australian frequency allocations today, but this is, I think a little more artful. Somebody should do there's a good project, right? Useful radio uses most areas of the spectrum, but this is where kind of the action is for us, where transmissions sort of percolate interestingly into and out of our lives. If you subtract the yellow and the spring green in this chart, you're left with usefulness. And at the very bottom is the green where CB radio is. There's a lot of confusion about it, a lot of people who are writing about it. CB is so well documented, but it's not the same as police radio. It was not used much, although it was used a little bit by cops. It's a bit of a creature of its own, and we'll talk a bit more about it. Radio waves propagate through air, objects in our bodies. At any point, waves are passing through us. How many transmitters are in this room, do you think? I mean, on me, I have a watch that regulates itself every night with a signal from Fort Collins, a cell phone, a laptop with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, a handheld ham radio, and a commercial radio modified for amateur use, a car key that talks to the car via radio, a camera with Wi-Fi. Some of you might be wearing earbuds if you're exercising your auditory autonomy. Using Bluetooth. These are all raw materials for listening, analysis, information. And you know, this is all about defamiliarization, right? Looking at the everyday and interrogating it. If you see a radio, ask, what's it used for? What messages does it send and receive? Who's on the network? You'd have a greater understanding of infrastructure, of power, of dependencies. Yesterday, Dr. Hayden came into Montpelier, and as we left, I noticed there was a highly armored Capitol Police officer outside, and I asked him what channels were programmed into his radio, and I learned that, you know, it's encrypted now, so the public has no understanding of what happens on the Capitol Police network, and sometimes they don't even save tapes. He takes it home to Maryland at night to chat with his friends. So in other words, it's being used for informal purposes as well as for official. Visible instantiations of radio. Very helpful, principally antennas and towers. When I first met Mike Payton, who's in this room, he was working on a project, The Antennas of Washington, a way of understanding radio transmissions and radio installations through the visible evidence of antennas. And more recently, Ingrid Burrington made this great book, Networks of New York, which pictures the physical appearances of the internet. So I had to cut out most of my history. It's very sketchy. But the first great counter-surveillance story in the United States is probably around 1914 when the German Telefunken shortwave station in Sayville, Long Island, some hams were listening to it, and they became aware that it was probably a tool of German espionage in that period before the United States had entered the war and the Germans moved freely in the United States. And they dropped a dime, and the government busted some people and closed them down. It's a story that will have some antecedents in the future. It's really hard to send a radio message that stops with the intended recipient. And so from the earliest days, transparency was a huge issue. This is one of my favorite books because it talks about opacity and transparency from the 1924 perspective. I don't know, can you see this? It's about, it's all about, you know, sort of the overworld and the underworld and transparency and the integration perhaps of radio with the body. It's a great book. It's online at Internet Archive. But the divide is actually 100 years old. Should the policing functions of the state be transparent to the public? So the 1920s, a wild proliferation of broadcasting. You all know this, the first police radio transmissions in Hartford, Connecticut. The police partnered with one of the founding fathers of amateur radio who kind of reined it in, made it less anarchic. Henry Hiram Percy Maxim, I guess the son of the developer of the Maxim gun. His station still exists. He worked with the cops to transmit bulletins that then ham radio operators would transcribe and like bicycle over to their local police stations. On the same page, of course, we see a Red Scare era story. So there's a focus on policing, on intelligence at that point. The Detroit police start their first station, KOP. Some of you know But it's licensed as a regular broadcast station because they don't have a police category. So every time they dispatch a police bulletin, they have to play a few notes of Yankee Doodle beforehand. I actually haven't seen a reference to this, but it's repeated all over the place. And people are listening to radio. You know, police radio is a classic example of useful radio, but early police radio stations were also pioneer public broadcasters. They beamed transmissions that were targeted as farmers and motorists and voters. They would do political debates. They had ag programs. They transmitted farm prices every day. Pennsylvania State Police, you could tune into their radio and get the latest farm prices. So it's a kind of pre-convergence, you know, of entertainment and information and usefulness. WNYC started out actually as a police broadcasting station controlled by the police commissioner, who, it says in this article, he wanted to get back at the newspapers for their coverage of the police department. So there was a political gesture going on there. But then very quickly, like everything in New York, you know, the police went dark and took the bulletins off. We have, you know, the gangster era, prohibition, increased mobility by people who are violating laws on the books. Radio allows a distribution. There's so many people who have written about this, but this is just sort of a placeholder. Police broadcasts lived just above the AM broadcast band, and they were very easy to hear. They were published in little radio guides, you know. And it was a mainstream activity to listen to the cops. It shows up in a lot of fiction. It wasn't terribly marginal. In New York City and some other places, you couldn't put a police radio in a car without a permit. The first person who got a permit to do it in New York was the famous photographer Ouija. And Ouija lived at 5 Center Marketplace opposite the police garage. Near Lafayette, where he could observe the comings and goings of the crime scene cars and then race them to crime scenes. When he left that apartment, he gave the lease and his police radio to my uncle, who was a freelance, and he's there as the poor man's Ouija in this news photo. So we have a little family connection there, kind of, sort of. World War II, you know, wartime and technology, super interesting, although we underestimate the amount of technological development that happened in the Depression. The Depression did not shut down technology. It may have made it a little more stealthy because there wasn't enough buying power to market it. But we see the training of many, many hundreds of thousands of radio operators. We see FM. We see the Manhattan Project. There's a great story about the Trinity test, you know, top secret, everything completely under military cover. But it turned out that when they ignited the first bomb in the Trinity test, they were using the same radio frequency as a rail freight yard in San Antonio, so that everybody could hear, and the ground-to-air frequency was the same as Voice of America, so that was a problem. CB, so in this room are people, and at this conference and elsewhere, are people who've done a lot more work about CB. I'm going to mention in this room Cheryl Higashida, Rory Solomon, also Art Blake. I won't go into it in much detail, but I do want to mention that there's a small but growing body of scholarship, and it really deserves attention. The history of CB winds around race, class, gender, geography, the space race, America's war in Vietnam, human-animal relationships, Quebecois nationalism, countercultures, you name it. Like radio amateurs, CB operators traded QSL cards, which started out as a confirmation of a radio contact, and then that faded. It became like the way you friend somebody. You know, at the beginning you friend people who you really know, who are friends, and then it's sort of, for many of us, it doesn't matter anymore. And people trade it. And there, evidence of the complexity and conflict is percolating through North America, and amazing examples of vernacular art. There's questions about CB. Is it useful radio? Well, are home movies useful cinema? I think it's incontrovertible that if CB is used to do a job, whether in industry or the activist sphere, it's useful radio, and I'm going to focus on that. Art Blake, the story of the trucker strike is fascinating. I'll mention in a sec, but Art Blake has done critical work on CB, race, class, and gender. His work on white vulnerability in 1970s LA argues that CB was used by middle-class white men to create an audible sense of order. In May 1976, there were over 1 million licensed operators in the Los Angeles area, and many more who weren't. And he describes black CB audio mobility as a circumvention of white-imposed immobility, and writes in great detail about shared black technocultural practices and a black sound, which you can still hear performed on CB Channel 6, the Super Bowl, and I urge you to listen. Civic clubs, neighborhood associations, mutual aid, neighborhood watch, safety, a moral panic about language and behavior. This is prefiguration of our favorite internet panics. CB is also an area where disability was made manifest and visible. I'll have some pictures about that in a second. Caught on internationally. Here's young men in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City. Here's CB turning into useful radio. The quote-unquote mistress of the quote-unquote housemaid is sending her to the farmer's market and discussing what's there on CB radio in Italy. The first lady, or the first mama, Betty Ford, part of the sort of workerist politics of the 1970s. And just a few QSL cards. I'm going to go quick. And most of these, a lot of things I'd like to show are not appropriate to show publicly. I'll just leave it at that. But if anybody's interested in more, drop me a line and I'll share a presentation with you. But I can't show them publicly. Space, amazing cards from black CB users. Whatever. This is when Rush Limbaugh was called Rusty. Rush is his dad. They were a CB family. For those of you who are moving image archivist, Janice Allen was a CBer early on. People doing, this looks like a zine maker almost. Undertaker, the last to let you down. The family, the French Fry family. This is part of a Pacific Northwest sort of a pictorialist tradition. This is an Afrofuturist card from Detroit. This is the mildest example of the genre that I could find. I won't go any, I won't go any. And there's a lot of FCC bashing, also a lot of gender warfare in these cards performed in different ways. And then there's people who are being very open about their disabilities. This is a big and I think very important trend in CB. And I love the electricity. And then I end with this really, really cryptic card here. So race and policing, race and communications, the landscape of useful radio in the 1960s was heavily, heavily racialized. I'm going to play you a short excerpt of a tape from Los Angeles on August 12, 1965, during the Watts Rebellion. I've been collecting recordings of that, and I've actually sort of subtitled it for you.
There's information received that two male Negroes on motorbikes with walkie-talkies in the vicinity of 5900 block South Avalon. Two male Negroes with walkie-talkies, 5900 block South Avalon. Check if possible. This is in the Watts area. 52 Chevrolet, white in color, containing four male Negroes with a sawed-off shotgun. Observed in the looted store area. Four male Negroes, 52 Chevy, white in color with sawed-off shotgun. Watts area.
All units concerned, looting has begun in the area of Brennan and Central. 1345 and units in the area, 13040. Report to protect life. Not enough personnel to protect property.
12A47 requesting help. 84th Place and Broadway. 84th Place and Broadway. Officer needs help, 103 and B.
So the LA police force was considered to be technologically advanced in that period, and California police in general were considered to be sort of a few steps ahead in development and police forces in other parts of the country. But this marks a point. Joseph Wambaugh, in his book, The New Centurions, and the end of the second page, the climax of this book is rookie cops who are sent out during the Watts Rebellion and how the dispatch loses control. And basically he writes, and he's confirmed this to me, he's writing about sort of a breakdown in the white sense that the city was theirs. You know, the white people no longer own the city, and it's a book that is I think, a quite sort of tragic, sense of the death of white control, but it's also the sense of total jeopardy where cops couldn't help one another, and that sort of ethic is gone. And so that tape that we played is actually referred to here. The next, I'm going to play a recording from Newark in 1967, and I'd like to say that it probably isn't a tape for sensitive ears. If this is the kind of thing that's troubling, this is a troubling tape for me, and it has a troubling history. It's not very long, but just like to warn you to cover your ears if this is an issue. This is from the long hot summer of '67. This is July in Newark.
Give us a bus at Broome Mercer. We got a cop hit. Any city bus on the air going to Broome Mercer. Cop hit. Did you receive that? Do you want to? Broome Mercer! A bus! We got a cop hit! Yeah, we understand. We got it. We're trying to get you one. Yeah, 513.
He must be hit bad.
Get down to that Broome Mercer faster than you're going now. All right, turn around and pick up another one at Broome Mercer. One of ours hit. That one's DOA. You can't do anything for him.
And they actually put a name out over the air, which is really weird and unprofessional. The story of that tape is actually, if you look in Tom Hayden's book, Rebellion in Newark, after a policeman was killed, the cops went into a number of buildings and some housing projects and basically killed everybody they could find. And I think there were something like 14 or 15 casualties. It's still disputed. It's a very sore point in Newark. And it's an example of sort of what these pieces of evidence don't say, but they need to be parsed carefully. So this was the year that cheap receivers came on the market. I had one. If you could tune into your intermittent transmissions, you could find something, and they sold really, really, really well. The ad copy, Tune In Crisis. And by the way, I'm aware of the distortion by presenting so many police voices, but it is, I think, part of the story. There's many broader issues about this that really haven't been explored. Scanners hit the mass market at a time of deep racial tension. Who was listening? Was monitoring motivated by the new demographics of city and suburb? Was it city dwellers? Was it suburbanites who fled, making a spectator sport out of urban conflict? Was it middle-class people fascinated with the exploits of the underclass? Were white Americans putting themselves in the position of observing conflicts between white Americans, black Americans, and police? Scanners went on sale. You know, they scan through and they stop when there's a transmission. They make it a lot easier to listen. They were expensive. A typical unit would be about $1,500 in today's dollars. There's a lot of reasons that people used scanners in rural areas. It was about mutual aid, about keeping track of what your neighbors were doing, maybe about amusing yourself in a media quiet environment. But in cities and suburbs, it is impossible to avoid concluding that fear of crime, fear of difference, plus a hefty helping of voyeurism drove these sales. Art Blake is, I think, a really good person to read in that sense, although he writes about CB. I would also introduce the idea of the personal panopticon, you know, building an infrastructure for personal situational awareness on a level that goes much further than looking at the bounds of your own property or knowing where the sirens are going. Many scanner folks built elaborate installations where they could monitor literally thousands of radio channels. Jack Dorsey, the co-founder of Twitter, grew up a passionate scanner listener in St. Louis, and Twitter actually evolved out of his plan to build emergency service dispatch apps. But he's written he's said in interviews about how he was a scanner freak. And Twitter, you know, it's funny, it's been an adjunct to useful radio, and at the moment there's great concern in the emergency services community because there's no more trustable authentication. This is the height of escalation in Vietnam. It's the period of greatest polarization at home. The perception of danger, popular perception, and crime was higher than it's been for 30 years. Conservative politicians, populist demagogues called for law and order, which was a code word for repressive measures against African Americans and other people of color. White backlash, the law enforcement and Assistance Administration provided R&D funding to electronics manufacturers to develop handheld police radios. And a lot of things happened. Here's a Bay Area activist explaining how to listen to local these are kind of amazing. There's a lot of these. In Newark, white vigilante groups and their sympathizers, the North Ward Citizen Council monitored police transmissions. They would often intervene in situations that they felt threatened their neighborhood. This is still true in some neighborhoods in Brooklyn. The Shmira Patrol, for example, in Williamsburg has been doing this for a number of years. Black Panther Party members in Oakland patrolled pigs. As they called it, they monitored the Oakland police, and they showed up to, let's say, observe police community interactions. Abby Hoffman, in Steal This Book, he advises activists to monitor the police, but he naively says you can do it with CB radios, which is naive. And then there's this long tradition of liberty-focused interest in useful radio. I do love this quote. If firearms are liberty's teeth and cryptography is liberty's voice, then radio scanners must surely be liberty's ears. I mean, this is no left-winger, but I love how they took their name, the owl from a Dead Kennedys song. You know, these sort of fascinating permutations. So entertainment, were people who supported law and order unconsciously seeking disorders? Were listeners identifying with authority or its adversaries, pro-statist, anti-statist? Was the attraction based on the fascinating ambient texture of the audio, the alternation between silence and sound, the desire as you wait for the next dispatch, the mixture of words and numbers, you know, the sound effect of police radios, you know, going at the end of a transmission, the squelch tail. A lot of people modified their radios to stretch that out to like 3 or 4 seconds. Or is it the excitement of privileged, closely held, forbidden knowledge? Scanners became programmable, highly sophisticated, all sorts of stuff happened. Today they're tools of work, recreation, and art. Moral panic. I'm speeding up because I want to get to some stuff that's important. The mystery, the veils fall around federal government radio communications. Hobbyists start to profile. These at first were shared among the trusted, and then they were published. People didn't just listen. They traveled to mountaintops to look at transmitters. I used to use highly directional antennas to determine the orientation of the FBI relay links. Some people, not me, followed unmarked government vehicles back to their bases, you know, and rummaged for evidence in dumpsters at radio repair depots. I did that. And gradually this matrix of information emerged. And so it's really, if you imagine the sustained and expensive engineering effort to develop messaging technologies over many years, and then this parallel effort by individuals to eavesdrop that goes back to at least 1914. It's a long-term effort, mostly on the part of working and middle-class men, some exceptions, to understand the characteristics and decode messages that were not intended for them, an arms race. And in recent years, this has taken a great leap forward. Now, you know, people reverse engineer complicated digital radio systems. People do SIGINT work. They travel to the perimeter of classified sites. I think people are doing state-of-the-art crypto cracking. I don't personally know, but I'm sure they are. This is a massive mutual education project that's developed around useful radio. And it's Somebody needs to write about it. As more radio became encrypted and it was harder to listen, people got interested in the topography and the infrastructure of authority, just as Trevor Paglen would later photograph Groom Lake at long range from outside the fence. Listeners trekked into the mountains like Groom Lake, Nevada, which is part of Area 51, to monitor military aircraft. I know somebody who's like an Uber hobbyist who made a lot of money in the tech field and retired quite young, and he actually poured concrete to mount his antennas on, but the problem was he did it on federal land, and so you can't really do that. You know, there's a whole interest in that. This is a collection held by an Uber listener. People spend a lot of money. Software-defined radios, you know, where the work of a radio is done in code. These can live in your pocket or your bike, or they can go up in space. You can replicate a $150,000 direction finding system for about $500. You can also start playing with these for $19 and a dream. Today, useful radio monitoring is taken to the cosmos. Private companies like Hawkeye 360 are putting SDRs in orbit, and even your walkie-talkie can be received by a satellite, you know, 80 to 120 miles. And if anything testifies to the evidentiary value of useful radio, it's this: it's the companies are spending money to launch satellites to receive them. Here's some of their use cases. They don't say anything about the content, right? Because that's probably raises legal questions. It's non-consumptive, but there's many ways in which the metadata is of greater interest than the content. Here's one of their promo videos.
If we could see radio waves with the naked eye, we'd learn a lot about how we communicate, navigate, and lead our daily lives. But until recently, we've been unable to study this marker of modern life. At Hawkeye 360, we're transforming this unique resource into a new layer of knowledge. Through our pioneering radio frequency analytics, we geolocate or pinpoint radio frequency emissions to illuminate global activity. It starts with our clusters of small satellites flying in triangular formations in low Earth orbit. With satellites, we can detect radio frequency emissions with an incredibly wide field of view, day or night, in any type of weather. Based on customer needs, we tune the software-defined radios to selected radio frequencies in our growing library of signals of interest. As a cluster passes over an area, each satellite observes the signal waveforms. Our satellites then downlink the signal data to a secure cloud environment, where our proprietary algorithms compare the waveform data of all three satellites. We look at tiny differences in waveform properties to confidently geolocate individual signal emissions, and then package signal characteristics and data for rapid delivery to customers. Our customers use this first-of-its-kind geospatial intelligence to reveal what was previously unseen, such as vessels trying to hide, changes in patterns and behavior, and new activity where none should exist. Our customers deepen situational awareness by leveraging our RF analytics to tip and cue other sources as part of a fused multi-intelligence solution. As our constellation continues to grow, revisit rates will drop to about half an hour to give our customers unprecedented access into a new dimension of knowledge that will help them make decisions for a safer world.
So put your cell phone in the icebox, you know, whatever. So scrambling, one key system that enabled scrambling, frequency hopping, was invented in '41 by composer George Antheil and inventor actor Hedy Lamarr. I just had to show you her memorial, which includes 88 balls representing the 88 frequencies in their patent. And if you look at it head on, you see a pixelated version of her face mirrored on a steel plaque. So this is about a monument to women in tech whose stories are often not told. scrambling was something that was only really good for casual interception. The feds didn't like that, and they spent a lot of money to add this fairly early digital encryption capability to key federal radio systems. This made a lot of people mad because it sort of criminalized scanner listeners. That's a nice Uniden scanner right there. But, you know, they kind of won out.
Frank Sam, Adam King, boy uncle, easy uncle.
Did you hear that? The letters, it was saying, so this is the Soviet consulate, and those codes are FBI agents in 1979 watching everybody coming in and out and figuring out where they're going, and this was continuously operating. And, you know, we wouldn't hear this now, but it was fascinating to see these kinds of things happening all the time, and I think somebody could have easily sort of re-engineered a lot of that. This is another, I think, rather stressful recording, but it's one of the few things in the federal radio bans, law enforcement bans, that isn't always encrypted. This is in southern Arizona.
22-118.
Go ahead.
Hey, what's your 20?
I'm with 155 at the entrance to Cole.
10-4.
My vehicle doesn't go discreet, so I didn't want to go in there.
Hey, 118, I don't know if you guys copied me, but they're kind of on an angle back there towards post office.
Yeah, 10-4. You said they were going towards Miller's?
That kind of looks like the line of travel right now. They're kind of angling back northeast a little bit, like they're going to skirt the hills there towards post office.
All right, 10-4. The moon is just bright enough that I think they're going to see us rolling in.
Yeah, 10-4. They keep stopping. They'll go a little ways and then stop, and then go a little ways and stop.
Hey, 83, Lima 118, do we have any MIDS agents headed this way?
10-4, we have agents headed that way.
At 10-9?
Yes, we have agents headed that way.
10-4.
Hey, groups kind of being a little weird, but they just went down for...
And that southbound Durango may have called out you and Zika if you're visible from the highway.
So the group is currently down at these cords 31.
So this goes on all the time, mostly at night, as people try to cross the border. The border is an incredibly alive space for useful radio. I'd like to play you a tape that came off YouTube about the Zetas. You know, the Zetas, they built with one... can I do it this way? Yeah. A man named Jose Luis del Toro Estrada, working with the Zetas cartel, built a sophisticated radio system in 2006 with hundreds of sites, bootlegging, I think, Motorola equipment. It was probably a digital system, and he worked with radio dealers and system contractors in the States, and it said that they sometimes put their antennas on top of police stations in Mexico, and there were other such networks at Sinaloa and in Ciudad Juarez. This is just a couple minutes of it. The subtitles come from Google, so they are pretty terrible. But for those of you who understand Spanish, we'll get a lot more out of it, I think.
Adelante, adelante.
Adelante, comandante.
Ese que habló hace rato.
¿Quiere que le quite las patrullas esas, comandante?
Ahí vamos para allá.
Soy yo para aquí con sus dos patrullas que mandó para acá para las balaseadas y se las balaseé yo.
Ahí vamos.
Sorry
Esta
about
pobre gente inocente que traen a la muerte nomás, ni balas ni cargadores les dan. Les debería dar vergüenza si los van a traer a la muerte, que traen que venderse. Ahí aguántanos, chavo, ahí aguántanos, vamos para allá, ahí aguántanos. Aguántanos, estoy esperando con el misil, si quieren pelear.
Doctor, no tiene la acción completa que me la apoyo.
Aguántanos, gente. Hace lo que quiera, que para defenderme yo solo puedo, no necesito animar a nadie. Y ahí le voy a dejar un elemento que me lo encontré vivo con otro muerto que tuve que matar por culpa de ustedes, que los mandan hasta acá, hasta Tamaulipas.
¿Lo estás grabando?
Que pase un buen día. Ay, disculpe la molestia, pero no nos moleste. ¡Ay, qué este culo!
I think it's a member of the press that's recording, and they're talking with them about recording. Even hippie commune members got into the Useful Radio Act. This is the gorgeously printed intercommunal newsletter published by the, what used to be the Diggers and Irving Rosenthal and then the Cauliflower Commune. And here people are suggesting a CB network and then a business band network to link communes all throughout California. I'm going to speed up a little bit. The uprisings of 2020, a memorable moment in Useful Radio, often difficult examples of police communications on top of what was happening in the streets. Out of that, we've seen a huge push to move encryption forward faster. There's a million, this is history that's very hard to tell because there's so many research sources to parse out, but we're feeling the reverberations of that. We're also feeling the reverberations of January 6th. It would be very interesting to try to put together an inclusive picture of the wireless environment in this neighborhood on that day. Ham repeaters were hijacked. There were portable radios. People were talking on Zello. The official record, it was encrypted, and some of it has been publicly released. Most of it has not. I think this is something somebody really needs to try to do some work in. Domination, struggle, and resistance. I want to move to an exciting and still embryonic history, which is Useful Radio's role in social movements and struggle and resistance. Right now, it's points on a long continuum, but I hope people will add history not so much as an antecedent to internet-based communication and cell phones, but as a robust set of platforms that we can still use. And I want to recognize the importance of Cheryl Higashida's work in this context. Her recent paper, which is here, details what she calls grassroots techno-political agency in connection with black dark surveillance during the civil rights movement in the Southeast U.S. This is a foundational paper that offers a really exciting framework for thinking about radio and social movements and really about communication, technology, and race in general. It is an excellent read. In the 30s, activists built the labor movement. They used radio as a means of coordination, information, and defense. I've never seen recordings of that, which means we have to imagine them. This is a story about intercepting police calls during one of the bitter ag strikes in California in the 30s. It's not clear if the communist organizers really had two-way radios, but it's possible. I'm wondering if the cops were playing a techno-futurist card to frighten the public and play up the dangers of new technology. A demonstration that's controlled by radio. I think during the civil rights movement, it's possible to think of the spectrum as a theater of electronic warfare in the American Southeast, which of course was also happening in Vietnam, and it's a story that I hope people will continuing to work on. KKK members and county sheriffs leverage the CB network. They jam civil rights activists and black self-defense groups. They set up their own emergency deputy sheriff network. This is described in Cheryl Higashida's paper, the work of Nettie and Isaiah Sellers in Moss Point, Mississippi, who built a CB radio system and a SNCC radio committee against great opposition. The memoranda offer a tremendous sense of the difficulty and risk that they encountered and the importance of useful radio and coordination and defense. This piece is about how they wanted to move away from CB to sort of more sophisticated and expensive radio infrastructures like the FM business band to build a more robust and interference-proof network, and how they lent radios to workers in Louisiana and then farm workers in California, and later the farm workers built a network too. Local safety patrols in black communities in the 60s. The Black Panther Party with CB radios at George Jackson's funeral. right-wingers using CB during the anti-busing demonstrations in Boston. The trucker strike of December 73 and January 74, Rory Solomon has written about this. The song Convoy comes out of this, and many other things, CB deeply connected in with pop culture of the time. Citizen-driven counter-surveillance, looking back, watching the watchers. These are the Hells Angels.
We got a phone call, and the people we're interested in have capability to monitor and utilize scanners, so be circumspect on giving directions, getting where you're going there, okay? Yeah, 10-4.
This is the FBI following the Hells Angels, who were sophisticated enough to listen to them. Radical environmentalists in the Pacific Northwest used radio equipment for forest defense. A European project intercepted satellite faxes and phone calls and documented and exposed the activities of transnational corporations. An anti-nuclear activist living near the Seabrook power plant in New Hampshire recorded radio transmissions in '89 where he heard technicians saying, "I'm a little worried about the valves." And he submitted a 6,000-page transcript to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which they sent back to the utility and found that there was nothing wrong, of course. The Ruckus Society and the 2004 Republican National Convention built secure messaging networks, but these were compromised, and the police threw disinformation into the stream. An Alaskan wolf advocate monitored wolf tracking devices to locate and defend them if their existence were threatened, and also recorded radio conversations with state naturalists exhibiting an anti-lupin bias. And so on. And this is something that Ava DuVernay called attention to. These were the jail ships in New York Harbor during early COVID.
Bravo, please forward all COVID sheets to the CC's office. All units, chemical agent utilized, chemical agent utilized. All available staff, we need you out here. Report ASAP.
Medical emergency in 3BB. Medical emergency in 3BB.
Be advised, I need a padlock for enhanced restraint setup. I need a padlock.
If that inmate fails to comply with your orders, you are to deploy guards to gain compliance.
That's a copy, sir. Emergency transmission. I have a fire condition. I need a supervisor to this area now.
I'm in the affected area at this time. It appears to be a smoke condition. I just need assistance with evacuating.
I be advised, I'm in the affected area. I got a medical emergency in 3C. Medical emergency. I be advised, I'm gonna need a gurney up in 3C. COVID testing. You have somebody on your gate. Visit COVID testing. You have somebody on your gate.
Be advised, that individual from the medical emergency is refusing treatment at this time.
That's a 10-4. Make sure you document the logbook, okay?
All diabetics have been produced to the clinic with the exception of the refusal.
Report to the war room. Report to the war room, MP2. I need you. Forthwith.
I'm gonna need Gentech to locate the combatants.
Can I get some keys for the leg shackles, please?
That's a project by Sean Vigezzi and Laura Poitras. I am just about done, but I've got a few more things. This is a great pamphlet. These are SHTF frequency lists. Struggles that happen within the spectrum might also have a relationship with struggles for spectrum. This has been an issue with Maori people who claim rights to the spectrum as an entity that preexisted the Treaty of Waitangi. And I wonder if it might one day be an issue that Indigenous Native people in the States or First Nations people in Canada might one day raise. I'm going to just go through traffic analysis and not do that now. and we'll talk about futures. Will useful radio be too ubiquitous and too déclassé to garner scholarly attention? Is there really a there? Will access and archiving be intractable problems for scholars? That's also an imponderable. Micro collections and micro histories seem like they'll always be available, but the road to macro histories is always difficult. When thinking about useful radio, it's possible to imagine that it meshes more neatly with sound studies rather than radio studies. You know, perhaps the ambient instrumental radio landscape is more a function of sound studies. I think that'd be a pity if radio studies proper became assimilated into mass media studies, just like all the film scholars who were trapped for years in theater arts departments. Will the route to useful radio studies route through the body as radio and the body unify? This has already happened, you know, with Bluetooth earbuds and Google Glass and so on. Is that how we'll get to useful radio? Regimes and traces of policing play far too big a role in our thinking about useful radio. Can we go beyond policing as we talk about this? This isn't a good place to end, and therefore I have a coda. Sound studies people sometimes resemble people who do habitat restoration in the landscape. I'd like to see an expansion of work people have done on sonifying the past into radiofying the past. In other words, imagining historical radioscapes. There's a glut of recordings of broadcast radio, but comparatively fewer of non-broadcast radio. For now, radio waves leave no perceptible traces. Reconstructing them as an act of imagination, like Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulations.
GM cabinet number 1. Assistance needed as GM cabinet number 1. Second request. Premium liquor cabinet number 2. Assistance needed as premium liquor cabinet number 2.
It's like a Walgreens. In seeking to imagine lost wireless landscapes, I'm guided by the conviction that physical landscapes are repositories of human and non-human histories, and that their close reading and interpretation opens the possibility of retrieving or activating these histories. In a similar way, I look to wireless traces to serve as records, or if not quite records, reminders of everyday communications between members of families, workers, activists, evidence of surveillance, command, and control, and traces of the everyday work of social and political movements and government reactions to these movements. In theory, electromagnetic radiation can travel forever. And one might imagine a giant soup of faint but readable earthly transmissions slowly accreting somewhere in the universe. But it's perhaps more realistic and certainly more actionable to think of wireless traces as still inhabiting the streets where they were first transmitted, as faint but imaginable reminders that places, communities, and bodies bear the burden of their history. This is consistent with some newer thinking in the archival world, that impossible archival imaginaries and imagined records may enable affect where facts have been erased or otherwise scarce, and that the imagined may be a space in which to create validation and community. When precarity and climate change impose limits on how much documentation we can carry, a turn to the imaginary may be pragmatic. Why engage in this? To take a step toward historical accountability, a kind of forensic reconstruction, an imaginary, phantasmic, retrospective traffic analysis with the goal of contributing to a reparative geography. Imagine, for instance, the words and sounds exchanged over CB radios in the mid-60s Southeast. What place might useful radio have in the toolbox of strategies leading us towards reparative histories and accountability? And as we ask this, we might also inquire into useful radio's ability to act as a lever capable of shifting power from one force to another, or even reversing its balance. This was a radio-controlled emergency siren that was shut down until the red-tailed hawk's chicks could fledge. Thanks for bearing with me. Thank you. I hope you haven't missed your trains, but Anybody that would like to, that has thoughts or a question? Oh, right. Since this is being recorded, we're going to ask that you take a hand mic and speak your question into the mic. And I guess I have to stay up here so I'm in the picture.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. If I've written on applied radio, you've made it feel completely new and completely unfamiliar to me. And I think part of that is because what I've written, I was drawing from paper records, and actually hearing the sounds and the transmissions and the recordings is such a different experience, and it has me thinking of eavesdropping. So it feels like we're always eavesdropping on these intimate encounters, these everyday performances, work performances, machines talking to other machines. And I was just kind of wondering if eavesdropping could be one of these imaginaries for thinking about the project of recovering and recentering useful radio. So thinking about eavesdropping as a way to indicate some of the barriers and the challenges of getting to our project, thinking about some of the serendipity and the chaos that's a part of that process, thinking about encryption as another one of the difficulties that you brought up, but also thinking about the ways in which it asks us to bring really different understandings of performance and the formal aesthetics that we can expect to hear. Not to mention ethical implications, as you brought up. So I was just wondering if I could hear you talk a little bit, if not eavesdropping, what are some of the imaginaries that you would like to see people bring to bear on these recordings when we reproduce them, when we study them, when we circulate them, when we teach them?
Thanks for that. I think a lot of it is affect, which is what you started really talking about, that the experience of actually listening to a document as compared to a description of it. I've thought about eavesdropping for a long time, and I think much of my life is sort of about riding that line. I've heard a lot of things that I wouldn't want to share. I've seen a lot of text come over the airwaves that I don't think is, appropriate to share. I would never want to, I never could listen to my neighbors' cordless phones, except when I lived next door to Cristo, because through the wall, it seemed like they were public figures, but again, it seemed wrong, and this is the space of fiction. There's lots of, John Cheever wrote The Enormous Room, not The Enormous, what was it called? The Enormous Radio, thank you, yeah, which is kind of a key text, in the 30s, 40s. I think we actually need to develop, I really value what's called in Chicanx thinking, the testimonio, what is a personal testimony, what is a statement, a memory that is personal, that isn't peer-reviewed, that isn't on paper. It's people contributing to an oral tradition and speaking as an individual, especially perhaps as a marginalized individual in society. And I think in some ways that's a productive concept to think about this. Listening is power, and you really need to get your positionality straight if you're going to work with this stuff. And this is why a lot of stuff on surveillance that's focused on just the aesthetics of surveillance and not the power relations, I think has some problems. I don't know if that's a great answer, but I think we need to sort of invent, really work through some concepts there.
Hi, Rick. I want to ask a little bit more about encryption. I'm not speaking on behalf of the National FOIA Advisory Committee, but as a member of the Freedom of Information Act Advisory Committee, it occurs to me that the increasing level of encryption mirrors what we are seeing in our public records laws, where particularly where I live in Ohio, it seems like every legislative session there is a new set of exemptions that is chipping away at what once was an excellent, one of the model public records laws in the nation. So you talk a little bit more about how you see the move towards encrypting police channels of communication, maybe paralleling or different from what we are seeing with erosion of general transparency and freedom of information.
So encryption used to be really expensive for two-way radio, and then when two-way radio went digital, it's really a matter of just checking a box in software. You have to pay for it. You know, Motorola, for example, will charge you a lot of money to check that box, but it's very easy. And, you know, there's no institution that's more self-protective than the police. And government agencies. They're just sort of by their very nature. We don't have a tradition of openness in most of these organizations, and there are probably some legitimate reasons for encryption, but there's just basic. You need to understand how your tax dollars are being spent. You need to be able to enforce police as if you're going to have police at all, police should serve you rather than dominate you. And at this point, the model is really, really broken and really, really fractured. San Francisco, we went to encryption, and we were kind of fortunate that they decided just to encrypt the mobiles, and so you could hear the dispatches. So, you know, that's, if you lead a stimulus-free life, it's pretty interesting, I suppose. But you don't understand the interaction, and you only hear that official side. And encryption is positioned as personal privacy of criminal history information, but there's ways around all that. I don't think that trend is going to go away anytime soon, just as public records are less and less public. But by the way, that problem's 100 years old. It was discussed in the 20s, and if I had more time, I could talk for 2 hours about that.
Hi, I love The Enormous Radio. It's one of my favorite short stories, and the Hawkeye corporate video that you showed us, I think, is one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. I feel like I've seen it in a David Cronenberg film, maybe Scanners. It reminds me of that fake corporate video he has in there for company Consec. We need to formulate my question. I'm sorry. I find it so shocking. What is protecting us from more and more of these private companies who are their clients, and what are they doing, and how do we find this out? I feel almost paranoid watching that video. Because it's so opaque. All that language is deliberately opaque, but also, frankly, it seems quite sinister.
Right. I think this is one of these nimble startups that's doing what it would take the government years to do, and of course that's their big client. I mean, there's other clients in the civilian space. You could certainly use Hawkeye to monitor, anthropogenic events that are related to climate change. It's used to see, ships that drop that aren't registered anywhere, but people who work on ships use walkie-talkies to talk with each other from the bridge to the bow, and so that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, we're in an age of it takes the age of transparency to another level. There's no question about that. Are we going to turn off our phones?
No, I mean,
yeah.
No one's going to do that. I mean, it's almost like we have to create something to like block frequencies.
Well, a communications bill of rights that's defined serving human needs rather than corporate or governmental needs, which don't always overlap. It's a big deal.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. I sort of two different things occurred to me, but I wanted to talk about the sort of imagined spaces concept a little bit. And thinking about, we're probably the fourth generation who's existed with the imaginary or the unseen waves coming from technology. And sort of how do we articulate the reality that we live in that is so different from the majority of human history, and start to ask the questions of how that has changed us as humans?
Yeah, I mean, what I hear from that question is that we even lack the discursive terms to, we sort of have to start language again, don't we?
We spent a lot of time doing transhumanism lately, so
right.
that kind of flows in there, but there's a sense of how our existence as humans is so different from everything that we read about humans who existed before the technology, and we don't really, sort of going off the idea, sort of humanism studies, but the idea that who we are as humans is so different from the humans who've come before that it's not necessarily an evolution in the sense of us as creatures, but a different conception of our existence.
You know, I think the science fiction writers are going to be our prophets and gods. I mean, obviously, Octavia Butler, Kim Stanley Robinson, who, you know, in many of his books, people have a quantum computer behind their ear. So they're connected, and that relationship is articulated quite thoughtfully. But I think it's sci-fi. Well, you know, that's where we'll have to get our policy from.
We've got time for two more.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, did I just make this for me? Okay, all right, all right. Thank you so much. I mean, I've had some conversations with you about this before, but to see it synthesized, it's such a marvelous amount of work to have processed here. But so I have a question about veracity or you know, authentication, authority. I mean, I think one thing that broadcast media does is sort of authenticate, you know, or at least tries to, most of the messages that it propagates. And so with a lot of these, like, you know, more peripheral communications, like, for example, in my CB research, I've come across, like, the story of how after the Martin Luther King assassination, there was a CB radio person called in on CB and claimed to have spotted the white vehicle driving away in the opposite direction where the person actually had fled, and kind of diverted some police resources. And a couple years before the trucker strike, there was this case of, like, one of these, like, kid in the well stories in the 70s and 80s where somebody claimed to have been a kid stuck in a truck, and people were trying to find him for days and sending messages out over CB. So my question is, if we shifting focus to this category of useful radio, like, two parts, like techniques for kind of like authenticating or, like, you know, dealing with, like, the possibility of, like, hoaxes, and then on the other hand, kind of speaking to your comments in the back, like, we could also look at this productively, like, you know, the possibility for hoaxing as, like, you know, scrambling and, like, countermeasures. Is that a useful area of tactics that we might, you know, examine?
Yeah, I mean, when you deal with print sources, you really can't believe what you read in these newspaper databases. And I do think sort of, what do they call it, packet flooding or whatever, you know, denial of certainty. I think that is a strategy that's been tried over time. I have a bunch of things I couldn't show, you know, about kids monkey wrenching police radios in San Francisco, you know, drag racers doing things, people broadcast, you know, kids stealing police radios and broadcasting disinformation to get the cops to go somewhere else. Stolen police walkie-talkies were really a hot item among, like, anti-war demonstrators and you know, Marxist-Leninist Maoists in the late 60s and early 70s. Very, very valuable. So, yeah, we don't really know. And in some ways it may actually not matter, because legend may be as important in some of these stories. Isn't that sort of what CB is about anyway, as performance of personalities that are far bigger and far less you know, accurate than far less precise than people's real identities? Yeah, I don't know. That's not a great answer. I'd like to think about that a little more.
I work in, by the way, thanks Rick for a great presentation.
Thank you, Ben.
I work in the field of emergency public alerting. So the strange sound you may hear on your phone that alerts you of an Amber Alert, an abducted child, hazardous weather, evacuations, this sort of thing. And the U.S. has had this system for 10 years, but the United Kingdom, just a few days ago, launched their first national test of this technology. And the pushback from the public and the press was absolutely incredible. People became instant celebrities who were proclaiming that the alert test would activate the hidden Bill Gates microchips in your COVID vaccine. Charities that work with women who were suffering abuse at home were warned to turn their phone entirely off if they had a secret hidden phone, because when the alert would come on, it would reveal the existence of their hidden phone. Car crashes, people were told that if they attempted to touch their phone while driving and the alert came on, that they would be fined immediately. Then you had the claims of malware to be inserted into your phone, and people started businesses where you could pay them to remove this claimed application. Actually, this system does not involve any app. It's part of the operating system. So there was just this gigantic paranoia in the UK. And of course, they say they don't get tornadoes and they don't get hurricanes. They don't have earthquakes. So what do they need an emergency alert for? Well, there's going to be another national test here in the US within the next few months. My office is going to run that test. And we're very concerned that this same kind of crazy is going to spread on Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and everything, just like it did in the UK. Although, of course, we're more used to this here. A lot of people think Donald Trump invented the emergency alert system. He did not invent it, but we're going to have this. So I urge scholars in this area to watch this as it unfolds sometime later this year.
I think the history of wireless in general and psychology or perhaps psychiatry, people have written about this. I mean, I love Jeffrey Sconce's book, Haunted Media, which is the first thing that comes to mind. But yeah, I mean, it's a supernatural, uncanny force, which is sort of why we do it and why we became hams, those of us who are hams. But on the other hand, it definitely fosters that kind of thinking for sure. I mean, we've had emergency alerts in the States a bunch of times, right? And we haven't. Nationwide tests?
The nationwide tests are infrequent.
Yeah.
On the phone.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Here we go.
Thank you so much. I heard a lot, and you've spoken a lot about how entangled useful radio and policing and kind of this militarized police state that we live in are. Along the line of your prompt to imagine futures and critical fabulation, is there a development path that you see, an alternative one, of useful radio without policing, or are they so intertwined that surveillance and othering kind of necessitates like the tech development of radio, of useful radio especially?
So thank you for that actionable and important question. I see sort of three arenas, and I'm sure there's more, but the three that immediately come to mind are community projects to rethink the world and rethink the way we think. I think of what is called, I think of Black quantum futurism that builds community institutions and community discussions around imagining new futures and questioning basic notions of temporality and history. That's an ideal venue to question the distribution of power as in communication. I think of indigeneity, and I think of, there's some really exciting sort of futurist development now in Indian country around native AI with different kinds of models, native crypto, where elders play a bigger role and where you use slow computers like they have on reservations, to compute. And I've been very interested in the notion of what native useful radio could develop into, as Brecht had this theory of radio that it should have been two-way, but it became one-way, and he was kind of wrong because he didn't anticipate all the at least the potential and emancipatory potential of two-way radio. But I think if you bring another perspective to it, there's the possibility to do some projects that aren't bound to existing power relations. And the third thing, I was going to show this. It doesn't mention radio, but I think it sort of almost does. In about 1968, Amiri Baraka, then known as Leroy Jones, described a black communications project, and he actually had some money and traveled from Newark to San Francisco State, where they tried to build a black communications project, and a film named Black Spring was made, and it was printed in I believe, the Yale Theater Magazine. And what it is a complete it's a complete reconceiving of an integrated communication plan for America built around blackness. It's newspapers, it's publishing, it's flyers, it's discussions, it's libraries, it's theater. It isn't TV and radio. I think there may be a little bit of suspicion about technology. It's also film, but useful radio is just in the background of it somehow. And I think that had that project thought about using person-to-person radio, it would have imagined it in a very different way. Oh, and by the way, people have written about this. This is not my discovery, but the last sentence of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. The Invisible Man says, perhaps I'll see you on the lower frequencies. And a lot of critics have said Ralph Ellison was extremely, he was an electronics genius and spent a lot of time working with radios. And the critical response to that sentence is that he was talking about the long wave band. He was talking about useful radio. He wasn't talking about broadcasting. And it was in useful radio that he conceived a space of perhaps liberation and a space of expression rather than invisibility. So I think there's many, many examples, and I hope it's an answer, but there's lots of great places to imagine it.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it, and please join me in thanking Rick Prellinger for this incredibly rich and thought-provoking talk.
Wow.